Thanks be to God. Good morning. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Stuart Williams. I'm here most Sundays. You can normally see me tiptoeing in the sides around 11:05 or so. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to share the word with you here this morning, and I'm even more grateful for all that the Covenant community has provided me over the past 2 years. Covenant has been a place of calm and encouragement during a challenging time in my life, and I am grateful for the opportunity to serve and hopefully encourage others this morning. When looking at this week's suggested readings, I jumped at the opportunity to explore this text, as the story of Joseph is one of my favorites in all of Scripture. But I feel that this reading alone doesn't quite convey the crushing weight and relief of this moment in the larger narrative of Joseph in Genesis. So I wanted to take some time to refresh you all on Joseph's life, with the belief that the story itself will carry its message. Before I dive into my summary, I want to tell a quick story as to why I believe hearing this recap is worth our time here today. About 2 years ago, when I was preparing for my Bible content exam, I started listening to the Bible as an audiobook as a way to help me study. I quickly learned that the chapters hit differently when absorbed auditorily as part of a larger narrative. Genesis and the story of Joseph in particular left a lasting impact on me as I deeply connected with the roller coaster nature of Joseph's life. Particularly at that moment in my life when I was balancing the relief at having graduated seminary with the uncertainty of a looming divorce and a series of ordination exams and life with an MDiv for which I felt utterly unprepared. The relief I felt at Joseph's weeping was truly cathartic, and I found myself weeping alongside him. My hope is that by telling Joseph's story here today, that this passage can be cathartic for you as well. So, who is Joseph? Well, Joseph is the oldest son of Jacob and Rachel, Jacob's fourth wife, the 12th child of Jacob, and the 11th boy. He is the second youngest of all of Jacob's children, his younger brother Benjamin being the youngest. But Joseph held a special place in his father's heart. His father even gives him a special robe, often remembered as the robe of many colors, but the text, or at least my text, only mentions that it has long sleeves. Nevertheless, it is a special robe, and we are to infer that this is a clear sign of his father's affection towards young Joseph, who was 17 when given the robe. So as I said before, Joseph is child number 12 of 13. Now imagine you are Reuben or Simeon, Jacob's oldest children, who were born to Leah, Jacob's first wife, who, may I mention, bore Jacob 7 children. And now, after being the dutiful sons, you see your elderly father marry a younger woman and start treating the children of this woman as superior to the children who came before. I can understand them being jealous and angry at the situation. That being said, being jealous of your half-brother does not justify what they did next. So Joseph had received his special long-sleeve robe, and he then proceeds to rub salt in the wound by telling his brothers about his prophetic dreams in which they were all bowing down to him. After the dreams, his brothers decide, enough is enough. 11 is plenty of brothers. Let's get rid of this pompous dreamer. The brothers, minus Benjamin, in a fit of rage, decide to kill Joseph. But luckily, Reuben, the oldest, convinces the other brothers that it is best not to kill Joseph outright, but rather to throw him in a pit. His hope is that they'll leave him in a pit for a while, everyone will cool down, Joseph will learn his lesson, and they can all go home. But Reuben leaves Joseph and the brothers alone. And while alone, the brothers sell Joseph as a slave to Midianites heading to Egypt. Reuben finds out what they've done, and fearing the consequences and judgment of their father, decides to lie and say that Joseph had been slaughtered by wild animals. Meanwhile, Joseph is suddenly thrust from favorite son to alone as a slave in a new land. But Joseph is extraordinarily smart and charming, and he quickly works his way up from teenage slave to top servant of the captain of the Egyptian guard. He is treated well and given significant responsibility by his master. This is the first of many examples of Joseph making lemonade out of lemons. But his time in this privileged position did not last long, as his master's wife soon develops feelings for Joseph and makes a series of advances on him. Joseph, out of loyalty to his master, refuses her advances, but she, in her anger at his rejection, accuses Joseph of rape, and he is promptly sent to prison. So Joseph has gone from top son to slave, and now from top servant to criminal. But Joseph is resourceful, and he quickly gains administrative control of the prison. It reminds me a little bit of Andy Dufresne from The Shawshank Redemption. So Joseph works away in prison, and then one day, the royal baker and cupbearer are sent to prison, and they both have prophetic dreams. Joseph interprets them for them, telling the cupbearer that in 3 days he will be restored to his position. But he asks the cupbearer, once you are restored to your position, put in a good word with me for the Pharaoh so that I can get out of this prison. All that Joseph foretold came true, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. And Joseph remained in prison another 2 years. 2 full years later, the Pharaoh himself has a pair of prophetic dreams. The cupbearer suddenly remembers that guy Joseph and mentions him to Pharaoh. Joseph is brought in to interpret the dreams, and he tells Pharaoh that Egypt will have 7 years of abundant harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. The Pharaoh immediately enlists Joseph as an advisor, and together they implement a tax plan that will ensure Egypt has a tremendous store of food for when the famine hits. During this time, Joseph would have 2 children through his wife Asenath. And here I actually want to read the scripture for y'all. This is from Genesis 41, 50 through 51. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." So Joseph has now found peace in forgetting his troubles and his father's household. Well, wouldn't you know it, the famine hits not just Egypt, but Canaan as well. And Jacob, now old and feeble, sends all of his sons but Benjamin to Egypt to buy food. And so the forgotten household shows right up to Joseph's doorstep. And Joseph does not exactly give them the red carpet treatment. He immediately recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. So he decides to toy with them a little bit. He sends them to jail for 3 days and demands that if they are to trade with him again, they bring their brother Benjamin with them. The brothers are dismayed at their treatment by this Egyptian and attribute it to God punishing them for selling Joseph so many years ago. Joseph seems to be acting out a long-held power reversal fantasy. He may also be worried that his brothers had disposed of Benjamin just as they had with him, and thus wanted proof that he was alive and well. Anyways, Jacob is dismayed by the request, fearing that he will lose his only remaining son of his prized wife, Rachel. It is not until they run out of grain and are again faced with starvation that he allows them to return to Egypt with Benjamin. Judah pledges his life to Benjamin's protection, and they set out. Joseph prepares a giant feast for his brothers and sends them back to Canaan, once again with bags of food. But this time, he places a silver goblet into Benjamin's bag. He has his steward apprehend the brothers on the ride home and accuse them of theft. Benjamin, to their dismay, is found with the cup. So the brothers all return to Egypt and plead their case. My interpretation is that Joseph is perhaps trying to rescue Benjamin or offer him a life of luxury alongside himself. He likely feels that if his brothers threatened his life and sold him to slavery, they likely have been bullying Benjamin as well. But what happens upon their return must have been quite the shock to Joseph. Judah makes an impassioned speech on Benjamin's behalf, of which I'll read a short snippet. This is Judah pleading to Joseph and leads right into today's verse. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please, let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come my father. And this goes right into today's reading. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. Joseph, in this moment, is absolutely wrecked. Imagine the weight of the anger Joseph must have held towards his brothers for selling him into slavery. The grief at the years away from his mother, father, and beloved younger brother. It's my interpretation that Joseph did not commit to revealing himself to his brothers until Judah's speech. When Judah, one of the brothers who had thrown him into a pit and sold him as a slave, offers himself as a slave on behalf of Benjamin, it becomes clear to Joseph that God has not only been protecting and shaping him throughout these long decades, but he has also been shaping his brothers. In this moment, Joseph allows himself to be reunited with his family. A dream I'm sure he had buried long ago. A dream that must have seemed impossible. How could he return to a family that had cast him out and forgotten him? And yet, through the grace of God, the impossible is made possible. And Joseph cannot help but collapse into weeping as the years of loneliness and hatred are washed away by his intimate knowledge of God's providence. No longer is Joseph a cold, calculating official tormenting his former bullies. Rather, he cries vulnerably as a lonely man yearning to be reunited with his family and amazed beyond words at the wisdom and compassion of his God. I recently heard someone say that we as humans are not machines, but rather soft animals. Joseph is a man of seemingly infinite capability and ingenuity, a man who time and time again had to pull himself up from the gutter, and yet this moment is his crowning achievement. Upon finally seeing God's will and purpose for him, he submits entirely, releasing his anger and grief to create room for God's will for him and his family. In the story of Joseph, we see that when living a spiritual life, being challenged and being blessed are not mutually exclusive. And we are also reminded that as God shapes us throughout life, he also shapes those around us. The anger we hold on to may be directed at a person who no longer exists. They too have the ability to be molded through God's grace. God, in this powerful moment, not only removes Joseph's loneliness, but also begins to forgive the shame the brothers have carried for years over their horrible act. The act is not erased, but because of the brothers, represented by Judah, having matured over the years and learning to put the well-being of their family, particularly their father, above their own will, Joseph and God reward them with protection from the famine and a new life in Goshen. To weep alongside Joseph is to weep in relief, knowing that as we hit our highs and lows, that God is working alongside us to protect us and to prepare us. We weep not just at the beauty and majesty of God, but at the strength, determination, and generosity of Joseph. He did not abandon his God or his gifts in a foreign land, but rather trusted that those gifts would eventually free him from slavery. A slavery not just to his Egyptian masters, but also to the hurt and anger he carried towards his brothers. While I am not of the belief that suffering is a privilege, I do believe that it is a privilege to be shaped, molded, and matured by God. Joseph's whole life prepared him for this one powerful moment. And through the grace of God, he was able to act in love and forgiveness rather than rage and vengeance. This same privilege applies to Judah and his brothers. They committed a terrible act that caused great pain. But they learned from the years of shame and acted differently when given the opportunity, and were thus forgiven by God and Joseph. In this Egyptian sequence, we see the human path quite literally collapsing under the weight of the godly path. Joseph, who now holds all the power, has been tormenting and testing his brothers for the last few days. But as he hears his brother Judah offer himself up in the stead of his brother Benjamin, he no longer clings to the role of Lord and judge, but rather collapses in tears and offers not punishment, but a solution to his family's problems. It is in this vulnerable act that the family begins to be restored and strengthened. May we all leave here carrying the hope that our human stubbornness will collapse under the weight of divine providence, and that our tears at the glory of that moment will wash